Hello everyone. Beginning today, I'm covering the entire history of Iran, beginning with the rise of the Medians, and specifically, this video will cover the sack of Nineveh when it was the first major event in the Near East in which Iranians were heavily involved, and it's definitely something worth discussing. I think that the history of the Iranics in what is today contemporary Iran really began with this event, and I think it kick-started the rise of the Iranic peoples in the Iranian plateau and the decline of the traditional Middle Eastern powers, as well as the rise of the Iranians in the Middle East as a whole. Prior to this, the Iranian tribes had been living in Central Asia, and they were only recent migrants into the Iranian plateau. They migrated from the environs of the Yaz horizon. Originally, the Iranics had their roots in the Andronovo horizon and ultimately hybridized with the native populations of the B.C.E to form what formed from that the remnants of this hybridization, and eventually formed the Yaz culture. And it was this Yaz culture which was ancestral to the early Iranics, one of which were the Medians, as well as obviously the Persians, the Scythians, as well as the Sarmatians likely never stepped foot in the B.C.E horizon, and were thus very much distinct from the other Iranic populations. Nonetheless, most Iranic populations by the 10th century BC were largely hybridized with the natives of the B.C.E culture, and this hybridized Iranic identity was really what was at the core of the Iranian civilization. So again, the later Iranian civilizations were not largely of Nordic stock or steppe stock. They were a hybridization between native Iranian farmers of the B.C.E horizon and steppe peoples. But anyways, now that that's aside, I can finally begin with this video. So around this time, what you had a declining Assyrian Empire, and the Neo-Assyrians actually were in decline. They were at their peak, but they began declining at around this time, and they were challenged by regional forces within their empire, as well as the external forces, notably the Medians as well as the Scythians. But this battle specifically, so in 612, there was a huge battle, and it was between the Assyrians as well as the Medes, who assisted the Babylonians in capturing and destroying the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. So at this point, the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire rather, had just they were just coming out of their peak. Their peak eras were in the 8th century as well as in much of the 7th century. They seeded the Middle Assyrian Empire, which lasted from 1366 to 1074 BCE. And this empire, the Neo-Assyrians, were the largest empire that the world had yet seen. However, after reaching their peak under Ashurbanipal, there was a lot of decline. They had wars against much of their regional rivals, notably Egypt, over whom they attempted to maintain their control over, and also the Elamites, who were who were a pre-Iranian peoples inhabiting what is today southwestern Iran. But nonetheless, what essentially happened was the Assyrians were now under a lot of internal pressure, and the arrival of the Medians, led by Sayacheres, and the resurgent Babylonian faction under Nabopolassar ultimately sealed the fate of the Assyrians, and the battle was a decisive Assyrian defeat. The Medians rather completely and utterly overwhelmed the Assyrian defenses, and it was likely and largely the efforts of the Medians which allowed for the Babylonians to be victorious in this battle, and it also was what allowed for the eventual collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and its replacement with the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In fact, the Babylonian Chronicles, which are one of the most notable pieces of they're the most notable written evidence we have from the Babylonian period and of Babylonian history. They record that the Babylonians were also joined by neighboring peoples, neighboring tribes, most of whom were Iranic, notably the Medes, the Persians, the Sumerians, as well as the Scythians. And all of these tribes together attacked the Scythians, obviously coming in from the Caucasus, and the remainder attacking from what is today Iran. Together they unified and they attacked the Assyrian army and decisively defeated it. This defeat ultimately led to the destruction of the Assyrian capital and the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, as well as the rise of the Median. So this was the first major victory for the Iranic and the Iranian peoples rather in the Middle East, and this allowed for the establishment of the Median Empire, which would later be replaced with the much powerful and stronger Persian Achaemenid Empire, and it ensured that the Iranic people would ultimately come to dominate much of the Middle East for the next for more than 1,000 years, essentially. You obviously had that interlude with the Greeks coming in and dominating much of the Near East, but nonetheless, ultimately, the Iranic tribes would continue to dominate the region until ultimately the fall of the Sassanid dynasty and the rise of Islam and the Arabs. So essentially this victory, this single victory at the Battle of Nineveh in 612 allowed for the rise of the Iranic people and the decline of the native Semitic peoples in the Near East. The native Semites would again not really gain their independence really for a very long time until the rise of the Arabs, as after this battle and after the ultimate fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire at the hands of the Achaemenids, the Semites would really not have any control over Mesopotamia or Syria, as those two regions would be occupied by the Persians and the Byzantines, or the Romans, respectively. So essentially what happened here was this battle allowed for the Iranian tribes to move in and to essentially allow for the decline and collapse of the native Semitic dynasties and the eventual rise of the Iranian peoples in the Near East. And that is essentially it for this video. There's nothing else I have to say. That's pretty much it. I think that this is a good series. I had a history series in the past that I was working on, but unfortunately that was delayed, and this is just a revival of that series. But again, I have not discussed the history of the Elamites here. I may do that in another video, but this is specifically the history of the Iranic peoples, beginning with this battle and the rise of the Medians, as well as the eventual rise of the Persians. And I just think that this battle was a major turning point in the history of the Iranic people, as it allowed the Iranic tribes to infiltrate the native Middle Eastern powers of the time and ultimately overwhelm them by the 7th century, by the 6th century BCE, obviously with the rise of the Achaemenid Empire. And yeah, that's essentially it. Please leave some comments if you'd like to, and if you'd also like to suggest any future videos that I can work on, please do that. I'll make sure to do that as well. But yeah, that's essentially it. On the genetics front, I don't really have anything to say, as much of the situation on that front is that it's pretty stable now. There are no recent studies on Iranian genetics, and there's no recent work being done on the genetics of the people of what is today Iran. But if there is, I will let you know, and I will make a video on it. And yeah, and also please like, share, and subscribe as usual. I would really appreciate that as well. Thank you and take care.